Dear friends, we invite our next speaker, Chernov Vladimir Anatolyevich, Doctor of Economics, Professor of the Department of Finance and Credit of the Federal State Educational Institution of Higher Education, National Research of Nizhny Novgorod State University, named after Lobachevsky, Russian Nizhny Novgorod. Chernov Vladimir Anatolyevich was born in 1962 in Chelyabinsk and 1991. He graduated from the finance faculty of the Moscow Commercial Institute. His dissertations include the mathematical interpretation of credit risk, the methods and models of analytics and management. He is an author of 311 scientific papers, monographs, textbooks in the financial sphere, articles in scientific journals, and he has participated in more than 80 scientific and practical conferences. Vladimir Anatolyevich is the laureate of the Best Book of 2019, the Best Teacher of 2017, winner of the nomination Scientist of the Year 2017, winner in the competition of articles on the fifth International Scientific Conference. The first place of the international competition of initiative research projects. 35 years of studying the works of the relic family, Blavatsky Synod, and many others, who have all made the basis of his worldview and mythological approach to the science. Chernov Vladimir, Doctor of Economics, Professor, Russia, Nizhny Novgorod. He will now present his presentation on contradictions and synthesis of scientific and religious consciousness.
Дорогие братья и сестры, вашему вниманию.
Dear brothers and sisters, I would like to talk about contradictions of scientific and religious consciousness. The philosophical and ethical teaching of living ethics, combining the best social, cultural traditions and spiritual values of the multi-confessional society, is able to compensate for the loss of the state ideology and its moral basis that occurred after the USSR collapsed. Since then, religious trends based on faith have begun to play a significant role in society. Traditional Russian religions serve to develop the society's spirituality, preserve traditional moral foundations, put a barrier to the demoralization of society, moral and cultural degradation of the population. They contribute to patriotic education, provide spiritual, moral, humanitarian support to the defenders of the fatherland in the geopolitical military confrontation, which prevents the revival of fascism. Unlike religion, science, another traditional field of public thought, does not simply believe the truth or falsity of ideas, but requires scientific justification, argumentation, evidence, use of research, technical means, measurements, gnosiological and epistemological approaches, or other kind of confirmation of scientific knowledge and results. Religion. Today we have such an example. One of the speakers said that science doesn't like virtual things because they cannot measure them with the devices, so they do not consider them to be scientific facts. Religion, unlike science, relying on faith, follows ideas not recognized by scientific facts and evidence. Does this mean that science should consider religious dogmas false and the Church should consider science inferior? We are dealing with religious and scientific consciousness. These contradictions between them often lead to conclusions about the mutual exclusion of religious and scientific statements. Still, there are areas of teaching that combine science, philosophy, and religion. They include proponents of unifying science and religion, as it has been before, as science and education were not separated from the Church. In Russian history, with the adoption of orthodoxy, the Church became the head of education for 8 centuries. As the Church is becoming a significant public institution that unites and strengthens the state, the question arises of the relationship between science and the Church and the science, since religious teachings do not have scientific evidence. Religion operates with faith, while science operates with knowledge. The objective of the research is to consider the contradictions between faith and knowledge and resolved in coexistence of science and religion. Global events of the recent decades clearly demonstrate the need of synthesis in the activities of mankind. Only where the synthesis is achieved, creative processes take place in the world and harmony is found. On the contrary, deliberate generation and aggravation of contradictions reproduced and strengthened antagonism in political, interreligious, interethnic, intranational, intersex, cultural, social, economic, legal, ideological interactions of people, intensified discord, hotbeds of tension have become an instrument of latent technologies of informational wars that spread aggression and destroy human foundations, lead to demoralization according to the notorious principle of divide and conquer. All this leads to destruction of nations, chaos, terrorism, incessant and interethnic wars, revival of fascism, and misery of population. There is a publication describing the chaos theory as ideological weapon in the struggle for the domination of the transnational capital over national sovereignty and interests. I would like to stress that this transnational capital is about that nationality doesn't play any role, and still we understand that all nations are equal. But here, the equality of nations still is accompanied by the capital on its first place. So the capital and its owners become the wealthiest. They put their interests in the first place. They put their interests in the first place over the nationality. So there is the difference here between the nationalities. The most important thing here is to become rich. And this richness is more important than nationality here. Theological science comprises some fundamental principles of judgments and justifications. At the same time, it is well known that in search of truth, professor and PhD in theology belonging to one of the religious denominations cannot allow his conclusions to be inconsistent with the authoritative religious primary source, Holy Scriptures, and their interpretations relating to his denomination. Without any doubt, it is vital and interesting to study the Word of God with each page touching upon and solving the most acute questions of the human soul. But can this knowledge be considered completely scientific? Einstein once asked a Catholic priest, "How would you react if science irrefutably refutes any Christian dogma?" The prelate replied, "I will wait until scientists find an error in their proof." It follows from this statement the priest's answer is not based on arguments and evidence of scientific research, but on his unshakable faith in the Holy Scriptures, in their authoritative theological interpretation, and in this case only of the Christian denomination, Such faith is not subject to condemnation. It is a matter of freedom of conscience. But it is here that a religious consciousness based on faith needs to be distinguished from a scientific consciousness operating with scientific evidence, justifications, arguments, and facts, where an appeal to authority is not a scientific approach. That's the difference.
Но главное, а у науки определяться
Science
нет признается.
doesn't have this
Исторические времена, когда
authority
образование и
approach.
наука принадлежат церкви,
In
отступление
historical
от
times,
столпов
when
канонов
education
стало
and science
ереси,
belonged to
а
the church,
приверженность
a
одного
deviation from the
определения
church
еретиком.
canons was considered heresy,
Еретики в этом
and
направлении
an
подвергались
adherent of
гонениям,
such
а иногда и
deviation was
казни.
considered heretic. Heretics were
Утверждения
persecuted
еретиков
from time to time and
оказывались ложными
sometimes
во многих
executed.
случаях,
The
но
claims of
действительно
heretics turned out to be
церковь не
false
может
in many
оправдывать
cases, but
величайших
not
ученых
always.
человечества.
Sometimes heretics
Ответным
included
забором
the
против
greatest
человечества на
scientists of
протяжении
mankind
столетий.
whose
И
discoveries
церковь
have been used by
по истечении
mankind for
времени
centuries.
соглашалась с
As time
истинностью
passed, the
некоторых
Church had to agree with the
проверенных
truth
умом
of
утверждений,
some time
а
tested
также признать
statements and to recognize
невесомыми
as
опровергнутыми
untrue certain
отдельными
interpretations
доктринами,
of authoritative
авторитетами
ministers
политики
refuted
церкви.
by time.
Итак,
And
апелляция к авторитету не является ни критерием истины,
so
ни ее доказательством,
when we appeal
но
to the
единственность
authority, it's not
научных
the criteria
доказательств
of
тоже не
truth.
абсолютно.
But
А
scientific approach
относительно.
is also
И в
not
этом
absolute,
смысле
it's
равно как
relative.
относительности истины священник может оказаться прав.
In this sense,
То,
beyond
что
relativity
ученые
of the truth, the
почувствуют
priest may be
свою
right that scientists will find an error
доказательную
in their proof with
неизменившуюся,
changed place,
внесены
time,
в
or
это некие
circumstances in
обстоятельства
the
с
application of the
изменением
acquired
полученных
knowledge.
знаний.
But
Но
even
от
from
этого
this,
религиозное сознание
religious
станет
consciousness
научным,
will
а
not
наука
come,
станет
will not
православной.
become
Или как
scientific,
мы
and
обречены
science will
оказаться
not
на дне
consider faith
научных
as
прав.
an irrefutable proof or scientific
Проверенная
fact.
относительность
The revealed
истины
relativity of
свойственна
truth is typical
диалектике
for
как методу
dialectics
научного
as a
познания,
method of scientific cognition,
доказательность выводов,
with evidence
которые
of
производятся
conclusions
четко
carried out
вместо
taking into
времени и
account the
обстоятельств,
place, time, and
постоянном
circumstances
движении
in
и
constant
развитии.
motion and development.
В научном одночестве
Various
растительные
religious
и
research
животные
organizations
исследовательские
consider themselves
организации.
scientific.
Например, в Институте
For example,
Бхактивиданты
Bhaktivedanta
экономического
Institute, a
религиозного
non-profit religious research
исследовательского
and educational
образовательного
institute,
институте проводят
conducts
исследования
research on the
взаимосвязанности
relationship between
науки,
science,
обществом и
society,
религией.
and religion.
Религии. Главный
The main
компонент
focus
работы
of the
института
Institute's
является
work in
противодействие
research is
исследований
research on
альтернативным
alternative
paradigm,
paradigm
необходимым
necessary
как в
both in
науке, так и
science
в религии,
and in religion.
для систематического
For the
изучения
systematic
формальных
study and
аспектов,
understanding
не
of
поддающихся
aspects that are not subject to
некачественным
quantitative
оценкам,
assessments,
особенно в природе
especially in
жизни
nature of
и
life and
сознания.
consciousness.
Институт
The
проводит
Institute holds the
всемирные
World
конгрессы
Congress
синтез
synthesis
науки
of
и религии.
science and religion.
И
And
как бы
no
ни
matter how
разделялся Институт
close
Бхактивиданты с научной
Bhaktivedanta
деятельностью,
Institute comes to scientific activity,
любые
any
научные
scientific evidence
доказательства
and
и открытия
discoveries
не могут
cannot be
восприниматься
perceived as truth
безоговорочным, если они
by
не
it if
соответствуют
they do not
догматам
correspond to the
священных
dogmas of
писаний и
Hindu
индуизма,
scriptures recognized
признанных
by the
международным
International
обществом
Society
сознанием
of Krishna
Кришны,
Consciousness,
деятельность которого
whose
связана с
activities are
Институтом
associated
Бхактивиданты.
with Bhaktivedanta
И здесь
Institute.
мы видим преобладание
Here we
веры
see the
над научным доказательством,
preponderance
а
of
значит,
faith over
имеем дело
scientific
больше
evidence,
степени с
which means that we're
религиозным,
dealing more with
чем с
religious
научным
than with
познанием.
scientific consciousness.
Означает ли это, что ученые
Does
средней
this mean
полосы,
that a
оперирующие
scientist
научным
of
знанием, не
secular
может
science
быть
operating with scientific
религиозно
consciousness
верующим?
cannot be
Или
a religious
полностью его
believer,
убеждения должны
or
быть
that his
атеистичными?
beliefs must be
Вовсе нет.
atheistic? Not at all.
Религиозные верования
Religious
не могут
beliefs
быть
cannot be
противопоказаны ученым. И нет антагонизма в том, что
contraindicated
ученый
to
официальной
scientists.
науки ходит в
There is
церковь,
no
служит
antagonism in the
богам
fact that
или
an official
совершает проповедь.
scientist goes to
В этом
church, follows
раскрывается
rituals, or makes
сознание
pilgrimages.
мышления,
This reveals the
воображение,
imaginative side of his
воображение.
thinking, consideration, imagination.
Двойственность, о которой сегодня говорили в
This is the
упомянутом отрывке.
duality that has been spoken about
Короче,
today,
следующее.
as the
Ученый
previous
может обладать
speaker
и
talked
научным,
about it.
и религиозным сознанием. А значит,
A scientist can have both scientific and religious consciousness, so to inhabit two worlds of the human mind. It is only important that he clearly sees the fundamental differences between scientific and imaginative religious types of consciousness. Intuition, which means that in science, he conducts research in accordance with scientific methodology and in a non-scientific environment of society. In the church and in relations with people, he can follow the principles of faith, enriching his worldview by collective images, ancient legends, allegories, intuition. Faith combined with imaginative thinking and intuition acquires special significance where science is powerless, but in the future it may come to discoveries predicted by faith. Ancient legends with their images and allegories, intuitive assumptions as the potential of scientific hypotheses and options for research.
Вот сегодня тоже это было очень хорошо, я рад был
Today, the
отметить роль
speakers
физических исследований.
also showed it.
Но
On the
ученый
example of
должен
physics,
применять все
scientists
свое
shouldn't
сознание
deprive
органа
himself of another kind of
удивительного,
consciousness,
которое
figurative,
расширяет горизонт исследований для будущих открытий.
religious, intuitive one, which
Естества
expands the
полагает
horizons of research for future
того,
discoveries,
во что
where
верит
the
ученый.
inquisitiveness of mind
Это
reveals the
ведено
truth of what the
не
registered
опровержением,
believes,
а
which leads to new
развитием
discoveries
науки и
or
инноваций.
refutations or
Обычно
to
это
develop
зарождается
science
в
and
воображении
innovation.
ученого,
Future discoveries are born in the
который
imagination of the
строит
scientist,
научную
which are
основу
considered
и
in the form
доказательств,
of hypothesis
рассматривает
before their
другие
scientific
идеологии.
substantiation and evidence.
Такое отношение к вере
This attitude
соответствует
to faith
этимологии слова
corresponds to
«вера».
the etymology
Если
of the
слова
word
«вера»
faith if we
«вера»
consider the first
начало слова
syllable ve
«веря»,
as the
а
beginning of
второе
the
слово
word no,
«ра» как
and
принято
the second
в
syllable ra
итальянском
as
народе
accepted in
«ра».
an ancient
Свет
Slavs, and other
изначальное
people ra
истины.
the light of original
Данное
truth. This
словосочетание
phrase
указывает
doesn't
не
point to the
на
truth itself as a scientific
саму истину,
fact,
как научный факт,
but to
а
its
именно
light,
свет,
illumination,
освещение, направление истины,
direction to the truth,
наводящий
a
познание.
beacon leading to
При этом
knowledge. At the same
видение
time,
«ра» не
the knowledge
означает
of
знание
Ra
изначальной
doesn't
истины,
mean
а
knowledge of the
употребляется в значении
primordial truth,
восприятия,
but is used in the
ощущения,
meaning of
чувствования,
perception, sensation,
продвижения.
feeling,
Вот это как раз и
progress
бывает
towards the light.
видение. Мы ощущаем,
This is the
чувствуем, да?
virtual thing
Так
we
вот,
feel with our senses.
продвижение к свету, его
Progress
постижение,
towards the light is
предвкушение его
comprehension,
знания
anticipation of the
высших
unknown higher
начал.
world.
Например, старики
For
говорили
example,
«отведай
in the
меду
old
и
days, they used to
отведай
say,
щей,
try some
другой
honey
ведомый
or
означал
cabbage soup,
«познай».
try
Означал
as
«попробуй», «вкуси».
отведай in Russian, which can be
До
interpreted now in the
постижения
literal sense.
человеком неизведанного
But this
оно
didn't
не
mean no,
поддается
it meant
научному
try,
описанию
taste.
и
Before a person
понятийному
comprehends the
аппарату.
unknown, it cannot be
Если
described with
ученый
scientific
оперирует
and
только
conceptual
существующими
apparatus. If
научными
scientist
инструментами,
operates only with
он тем
existing
самым
scientific
отсекает себя
instruments,
от
he
возможностей
thereby
новых
cuts
открытий.
off from himself the possibilities
Тогда
of
за
new
пределами
discoveries
восприятия
beyond the
современного научного
perception of the
аппарата,
scientific
который
apparatus that is
перевоплощается
evolving
и
and improving
совершенствуется
as
в
a result
результате
of new
новых открытий.
discoveries.
Да, мы открываем новые
We
приборы,
discover
которые
new
несут ответы на
devices
вызываемые
that
трудности,
can
которые
discover
еще
that virtual
вызваны
world
иными.
which is
Хотя
not measured
современный
at the moment.
научно-сознательный
Going beyond the
ученый
limits of
ищет
scientific
знания,
consciousness,
которые
the
дают не
scientist
только
is looking for knowledge
смертоносные научные
that can not
открытия,
only become
но и
new
расширяют
scientific discoveries,
когнитивный
but
аппарат
also expand
научных
the
исследований.
conceptual apparatus of
Например,
scientific
такое не
research.
раз
For
встречалось в
example,
фантастике,
this has happened more
которая
than once with
известна
fiction,
современным
which as
находила
is known, was eventually
проявление
expressed in
инновационных
innovative
научных открытий.
scientific discoveries.
В историческом
In the
прошлом
historical past,
наука
science didn't know
не
about
знала об
electricity
электричестве
and
и
radio waves
радиоволнах,
that go
находящих
beyond the
начало
perception
всему
of human
человеческому
organs.
познанию. И эти
Those
явления,
phenomena,
ставшие для нас
which have
повседневными,
become everyday for
могли быть
us now,
доказаны наукой
could not be
только за
proved by
отсутствием ранее
science in the
способностей
past
к
due to the
постижению.
lack of devices
Поэтому
capable
неверно
of
утверждать,
detecting
что
them.
в чем действительно
Therefore,
наука,
it would
что
not
это
be true to
восприятие
say
новым
that
когнитивным аппаратом
to say that what science is powerless in, what is not perceived by its conceptual apparatus, cannot be measured by existing instruments, and has not been proven by it, cannot exist implicitly. Interrelation of figurative and scientific thinking is manifested in the teaching of dialectics developed by Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. The Hegelian triad, thesis, antithesis, synthesis is the scientific embodiment of religious images and allegories in the form of the Christian Trinity, the Hindu Trimurti, Sanskrit Trimurti, three faces, a triad that unites the three main deities of the Hindi pantheon, Brahma, the creator, Vishnu, the guardian, and Shiva, the destroyer, into the whole. This concept corresponds to the sacred sound Aum from the Hindu and Vedic traditions as the original mantra, the word of power. Aum is often interpreted as symbol of the divine triad of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. In the Old Slavic Vedic faith trinity, in the form of three worlds, Yav, Prav, Nav, holding the earth, according to ancient legends, are allegorically symbolized in the image of three whales. For more information about the connection between dialectics and religious teachings, see the article. In this sense, historical experience shows that religious sources based on the spiritual, moral, and ethical aspects of existence of person and society, to a certain extent historically predetermine the knowledge of the laws of the development of nature, society, and thinking, the methodology for studying social relations in various spheres of human activity. Religious sources, as well as epics, legends, myths, tales, fairy tales, are not and cannot be scientific. They do not contain scientific facts, but figuratively express the deep, sacred meaning of allegories from parables, stories, legends, conveying the greatest wisdom of human thought through meaningful images. It is the quintessence of wisdom and knowledge extracted from the historical experience and spiritual heritage of mankind. In the perception of their content, a person operates with imaginative thinking, figures, even the simplest fairy tales about for our kids, Kolobok, Kurочка Ряба, they contain a great wisdom within themselves. What is the most important thing? The child understands the fairy tale without interpretation, unconsciously. The things that are in the fairy tales, they teach humans through the subconsciousness. These fairy tales teach us most important things in life. Allegories allow us to figuratively convey the key of principles and law of coexistence of mankind through images taken from the daily practice of human life in order to be understandable to a person from his life experience. For example, the Bible. Many stories are taken from real life, so the person can understand those stories from his life experience.
Выявление причинно-следственных связей.
Penetration into the essence of phenomena, content of forms, understanding of cause and effect relationships, trinity of evolutionary processes, phenomena and forms, dialectical triad or Christian Trinity are not comprehended by calculations, but by the power of thought, expansion of consciousness to accommodation. Ideas transmitted not only through the forms of scientific conceptual apparatus, but also through images. The words of Jesus, I have much more to say to you, more than you can now bear. This is New Testament, call for the expansion of consciousness to accommodation, to a qualitatively new state of consciousness, conveyed in the allegorical, figurative expression, being born again. This expression is also in Ioann's Testament
Так, о малом и
about the small, the insignificant, and the pitiful. Humanity doesn't compose legends, Rerich writes. He notes that recently the historical significance of legends and myths has been recognized. Many valuable archaeological discoveries have been based on legends. The well-known collector and researcher of folklore, Afanasyev, argued the fairy tale is not an empty fold in it, as in general in all the creations of the whole people there couldn't be, and in fact there is neither a deliberately composed lie nor a deliberate deviation from the real world. The wonder of fairy tales is the wonder of the mighty forces of nature. In this regard, Likhachev, well-known historian of the 20th century, researcher of ancient Russian literature, academician, writes that historical views most vividly reflected in the epics should be subjected to study. We shall understand when and under what circumstances the historical concept of Russian epic was created. It is by no means an accident. People actively perceived the events of their time. Its creation was dictated by historical necessity. It represented a lively response of people to the fate of their homeland. This statement fully corresponds to the relative truth of the Marxist-Leninist philosophy of materialism, according to which all ideas, including mythological ones, are a reflection of objective reality, matter, which means the background experience imprinted in the images of legends, tales, etc. In the study of historical facts and the epic, it is important that scientific and religious consciousness, knowledge, and faith coexist, but are not identified and are distinguishable. Both of them are necessary for humanity in understanding of the world and the human soul, the definition of which is considered in the article, but their haphazard mixing will only lead to the loss of a clear understanding of the world, which requires the separation of faith from knowledge. Each of the types of consciousness plays its role in society and its evolution. Where science is powerless, faith leads humanity to the borders of the unknown on a moral path, proven and not refuted by time. However, without science, humanity is not able to know the world, comprehend its existence, develop intellectually and creatively. The truth, proven by science, becomes known and fully mastered by the human mind. The Theosophic is considered to be the teaching that brings science and religion together the most. One of the most tasks facing Theosophy is to reconcile all religions, sects, and nations with a common system of ethics based on internal truths. Hence, the motto of Theosophy, there is no religion higher than truth. Anyone can become a Theosophist regardless of what religion he professes or even is an atheist. With this approach, scientific research, conclusions, and evidence are not limited to religious dogmas, which is typical for scientific consciousness. Thus, Theosophy becomes closer to science than any of the religions. One of the key founders of Theosophy is Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. She didn't call the ideas set forth in her writings complete or exhaustive, but rather spoke of them as keys unlocking the doors to a deeper study. Thus, the teaching of Helena Petrovna Blavatsky reveals to scientists new hypotheses, directions of researches, and discoveries that require scientific evidence of refutation, the formation of scientific facts. In one of her most fundamental works, The Secret Doctrine, Synthesis of Science, Religion, and Philosophy, Blavatsky states, knowledge is above all everyone who has brought a piece of knowledge is already a benefactor for humanity. Everyone who has gathered sparks of knowledge will be a giver of light. Let's learn to protect every step of scientific knowledge. Neglect of science is immersion in darkness. Quick. The research started by Blavatsky was later continued by the family of Rerich. For this purpose, Urusvati Institute was established in Kula in 1929, which launched its activities in the 30s of the 20th century. The Central Asian Expedition of 1928 played a special role in its preparation. The unique collections that were collected on the route of his expedition made it possible, without slowing down the pace of work, to join the research, introducing the methods of a new science at the Institute, considering knowledge from different sciences as something synthetic, not divided into different areas. Rerichs reflected this idea in the structure of the Institute itself. A grandiose undertaking was conceived, the City of Knowledge, which was to become a global catalyst for the new science of cosmic thinking. The most prominent scientists of various countries collaborated with the Institute and participated in its programs. The Rerichs established the closest interaction with scientists and cultural figures of India. Among Western scientists, employees, and advisors of Urusvati Institute are Einstein, Millikan, Broyle, President of the American Archaeological Institute, Magafin, famous traveler and researcher Sven Gedin, Professor of the Pasteur Institute in Paris, Metalnikov, Orientalist Lazinsky, Professor from Paris, Bonison, French archaeologist Merrill, and many others. Until the arrest of Vavilov, Soviet academician, he corresponded with Sviatoslav Rerich on problems of botany. In Urusvati Institute, the methods of empirical science were combined with meta-scientific ones. At the same time, the moral and ethical issues were of the most important importance. The founders were highly spiritual and moral people who carried a new cosmic worldwide. The spiritual knowledge accumulated in the Himalayas was experimentally confirmed. The problems of human co-knowledge, psychic energy, as well as the influence on human energy on scientific experiments, occupied a considerable part in the works of the Institute. All this formed different approaches to laboratory research. All these actions assumed not only the future of a new science, but also the future of the evolution of mankind, its transformation, its new forms of existence. In Tibet, scientific knowledge was mixed with religious and philosophical ideas, so monasteries have been the keepers of valuable information for centuries. Ancient knowledge was used by Rerich family in their scientific work. Please have a look at the pictures. Data that Rerich got from Asian researchers were about the inner energy of people and interaction with the environment. This kind of knowledge was unusual then and is unusual today. And unfortunately, not all plans of Rerich could come true. Unfortunately, the university was not able to function anymore. In the early 1930s, the global economic crisis began. The organizations that financed Urusvati Institute could not do it anymore. The income from the sale of paintings is not enough to maintain the entire scientific institution. Other sources of funding have been scooped off. In 1937, the war in China began, the Second World War was coming, and in 1938, the institute and all the research carried out was suspended, as they say, until better times. Several decades have passed, the world is changing. Currently, Urusvati Institute of the Verichs is resuming its work in the Himalayas. The scientific circles of Russia and India have begun negotiations on the resumption of work of the Urusvati Institute research laboratories. The International Trust of Verichs, as Mikhail Chiryatev said, advisor to Russian Academy of National Sciences and one of the trustees of the trust, the results concluded a corresponding cooperation agreement with the Ministry of Science and Technology of the government in India. Even though it has only worked for 10 years, the results of its activities have had a great impact on the world science. In recent years, the efforts of the International Center of Verichs, ISR, have been carried out to put in order and approve measures for the preservation of scientific collections at the Institute. With the assistance of ISR and the International Rerich Memorial Trust, leading Russian scientists worked at Urusvati Institute and some regions of Himalaya Pradesh from 2010 to 2018. They examined the ornithological, geographical, and botanical collections of Verichs and conducted expeditions to study the flora and fauna of these territories. Lisovsky, Zoological Museum of Lomonosov, Moscow State University, candidate of biological sciences, Shatko, main botanical garden of the Russian Academy of Sciences, and Potapova, candidate of biology and scientific secretary of the Council of Botanic Gardens of Russia, have carried out scientific processing of ornithological and botanical lectures of Urusvati Institute. In autumn 2018, Shatko continued to study the flora of Kulu and adjacent territories. An exposition of Verich's research in the Western Himalayas is being prepared. Ahead is the solution of huge tasks for the reconstruction and development of the modern International Scientific Center of Urusvati Himalayan Research Center, the revival and extensive activities bequeathed by Verich. Thank you for your attention.
Vladimir Anatolyevich, thank you for your presentation. There is so much information for us to understand, and we'll discuss it further during our roundtable. You have an opportunity to further talk about your information now after your presentation, your great speech, and the conclusions that you derived, this cause and effect relationship. We now can understand and say that as a fact that studying the works of Helena Petrovna Blavatsky and the Relic Family, dictates and a scientific approach, it needs a scientific approach. And when the scientists all over the world think about the new hypotheses, new discoveries, and they find scientific proofs that you've mentioned in your presentation, then that will, of course, happen in the future. And this approach and understanding is necessary. So thank you, Vladimir Anatolyevich Chernov, for your presentation.